Hey, I'm Cedric Chambers, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of the 3D Podcast, a masterclass where we share with you everything you need to know about how to transform diversity and inclusion in your organization as well as in your community. We're on a mission to amplify the voices of leaders that are making an impact in the world today so that we can have a better tomorrow. Our goal every episode is to keep it simple, honest, and transparent with you by uncovering the truths in diversity and inclusion with the hope of creating behavioral change, all while presenting it from a unique perspective. So look, if you're ready, get your notepad out, pour you a drink, and let's dive deep as we discuss the dimensions of diversity. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of 3D Podcast, where we speak to real practitioners who are making real change in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I'm excited for our discussion today as we are speaking to one of the most genuine souls I've probably ever met. Today I had the privilege to speak to Dr. Salima Bhimani, the Chief Strategist and Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Systemic Change for the Other Bets at Google. Dr. Salima has over 23 years of experience in the public, private, international, and academic sectors. Dr. Salima currently leads, partners with, and enables the Other Bets, Alphabet's moonshot companies to achieve equity, inclusion, and increased representation through systemic transformation. So grab your tea, get your notepad ready, because we are about to dive deep as we discuss the dimensions of diversity. So Salima, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fabulous. How are you?
Oh, I'm wonderful. I can't complain, or let's say I won't complain.
Well, it's hot
Let's
here.
see.
I'm telling you, I'm hot. It's like super, super, super hot in the Bay Area.
Oh,
So,
no,
whew,
it can't be. Look, it's Georgia right
look,
now is
oh,
is 90
oh, you had it out.
plus.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, trust me. And the wind is not blowing at all. So
All right, we're not even
no.
going to do a comparison then, you and I.
No, it's all right. It's all right. Well, look,
Me
I'm
too.
excited to really dig into kind of the topic, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But,
Mhm.
as I start every show, I love to just, get some background as well as for the audience, get to know you a little bit more and really just understand kind of your journey and your career path, because a lot of different practitioners in this space, they come to this work from different paths, different journeys. And as we're going through, I want to make sure that we highlight your background and just learn a little bit more about you. And so if we could just start there, like, can you just share more about your
Yeah.
background, kind of who you are, how you got into this space, and let the
Yeah.
audience know a little bit more about Salima?
I'm happy to do that. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Cedric. And I love that you're doing these conversations. They're so important. And so I'm honored to be here with you. So, my background, depending on how we interpret background, I come from a refugee family that moved to Canada in the 1970s. And very early in life, when I was about 3 years old, I had my first encounter with racism. And it was very, very, very early on. And I am almost surprised I remember it. But it was an experience where my parents and I came home from being somewhere, and I was sitting in the back. And at the time, I'm not sure they had real car seats, to be honest with you. It was just like a bucket. You sat in this little
We're not
bucket.
gonna tell. We're not gonna tell.
This was the 1970s. Anything was possible. Anything was happening there. Anyway, we arrived at home and we came home to our house being blanketed in toilet paper and spray painted. And it said, Packies go home. And for anybody who knows that word, Paki, it's a derogatory word for brown people and was used heavily in the 1970s and 80s as it was a racial slur, essentially. And so I just remember looking out the window, not understanding what was going on, but having this feeling like something was terrible. My parents' voices were really loud. And I had this sense, oh no, like there's something wrong with us. Like we don't belong here. And it was a feeling, right? Because I couldn't articulate it at 3, but it was a feeling. And so, since I've been a child, it's always, and for a lot of people of color, obviously in different ways, for Black folks, for brown folks, for Latinx folks, the realization that this world was not necessarily designed for me. This world that I existed in was not necessarily meant for me. And that's the message I kept getting, right? You're a visitor here. We're hosting you. You better be good, you better behave, you better right. And so all of those messages were a big part of my reality for since I was a child. And that really shaped my own worldview about what it meant to be a woman, what it meant to be a racialized person, and in North American society, and what is it that we actually have to do to create a situation where I don't feel that way. where others don't feel that way, where others feel like this world is also theirs. They are also part of the quote unquote human race. And so that kind of set me down a path of, from an educational perspective, doing all of my educational background is in racial equity and gender equity, and that's always been kind of the path for me, both globally and in North America. And then from a career perspective, I started my career in the global South working on women's human rights from an economic and educational perspective. And I worked in the mountainous areas that are really like very rural and inaccessible in most cases. And so really working with women there to help them. Well, they were very empowered already. I was just kind of, sidekick to all of the amazing work that they were doing, but really working with them on how to increase economic and educational rights. And so that's where my career began. And from there, it's built off of that. And I ended up in government where I was working on looking at racial profiling of Black youth within the educational system and also law enforcement, and making recommendations on how we could actually change resourcing channels within these institutions so that they were putting the money in the right places to address the right problem, because usually they didn't know what the problem was, so then the money was going in the wrong places. So I did quite a bit of that work. And then, on and on I can go. But, it moved from sort of government, nonprofit government, ended up in the educational system because through that work I realized, gosh, the educational system is leaving behind Black and brown kids in a real way. And I had the wild idea that I could go into the education system and make a difference. And I did. I was there for some time. And then I decided that I needed to pause from all the work I'd been doing for over a decade and wanted to just take a moment. I did my PhD. And, from there, I ended up in academia for a little while and then decided to start my own consulting firm, which I did, kind of taking the last sort of, 15, 20 years of my work and putting it together in this consulting firm. And then I realized that I started to ask myself the question, like, where is the money? Because if you think about it, like, where the money is and where the power and money being just one aspect of power, but wherever the power is where you got to go to make the change, is what I always say. You don't really try to make the change where the power isn't always, because sometimes that makes sense, but sometimes it doesn't make sense because they're not the people that are influencing the big decisions that are happening. They're not even making the big decisions, right? So I started to ask myself that question. It became clear to me that tech was an arena that was having a huge, massive influence on people's lives, whether it was like biotech or whether it was like mobility and movement, whether it was, literally how knowledge gets transferred between people and communities. And so I thought, well, then that's where I have to go, because if those institutions and if tech is not thinking about this in a deep way and is not really considering what outcomes they're having on historically underrepresented groups and historically disadvantaged groups, then that's a massive problem. And obviously, there's a lot of people who've been working in this arena for a lot longer than I have in tech, I mean, but I thought I could make a contribution. And that's why I ended up where I am right now at Alphabet. Yeah.
Nice, nice, nice. And so let me ask you this: as you navigated, through your career and kind of, up until this point now, and you've worked in different sectors, and so informing the work that you do today, like what are some of those key learnings that you got as you kind of went through that
Mm.
process, looking at it from different industry, different sectors, right? Dealing with law enforcement, dealing with education. I can imagine there's similarities, but I also can imagine there are differences as well in those spaces. So what are some of those learnings that you kind of grab and use today from those places?
I think we have to be clear about the problem we're trying to solve
Okay.
and the extent to which we can actually solve it. So, as an example, people come at this work from many different angles and in all kinds of ways. And, for me, who's been in this industry or in this work, sorry, for decades,
Mm-hmm.
one of the big things that I asked myself is, what is the change actually? And that for me is institutional and systemic change. And I've talked about that a little bit before. And what that fundamentally means for me is that, whether it is the healthcare system or whether it's our economic systems or whether it is, the educational system, if there are groups of people that are having inequitable outcomes and unjust and unfair outcomes, then we have a problem. And we know that this is historically true. That's not going to get solved by setting up ERGs. Sorry.
No,
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 no, I don't
go
want to,
there, go
I don't
there.
want to.
I love it. Go.
It's not going to happen. I'm sorry to say it, right? We've historically put the burden on underrepresented folks to make change. Well, that's not working. In I mean, in the sense of like having massive systemic change, We need white folks to change, right? We need the people who have the power to change. And what we've done, I think, essentially is when institutions have decided to take this work up, and I think every industry is so different from each other, right? Education has a long history of taking this work up, oftentimes in ways that hasn't got them that far, unfortunately, or far enough. Law enforcement has a history, healthcare has a history. But what I'll say about all of it is that at the end of the day, for me, if we're not thinking about this, are the things that we're doing actually leading to real outcome changes? In other words, are Black folks now being paid equitably, which lead to wealth generation, right? Which address historical wealth inequity? Are people who are going through the healthcare system, in fact, now getting the kind of care that they need so there aren't adverse impacts on their mental and physical health ongoing and for generations? That's the work that we need to do. And this other stuff, like around like setting up ERGs and doing all that, that's to appease the system. So the system can say, oh, look, we did something. But that's not the work. I mean, sure, listen, I think setting up ERGs, if you all want to do that, go ahead and do it because people need community and that's really important. But to think that that's actually what changes the system, I think at this point we have enough evidence that there's just some things that don't historically work. And I think that the world of equity, inclusion, and diversity have to take stock of that. And the last thing I'll say about this is I think one of the fundamental problems that I find, and when I came into tech in 2017, which is not that long, I'm still a newbie around here, is that they weren't focused on equity. They were focused on diversity and inclusion. And diversity basically meant a lot of people like us around the table, maybe, hopefully, if we make it through, we prove ourselves enough to make it through. Inclusion is like, yeah, okay, so you're here and let's do some like steel bands and samosas for you, right? And then, but the equity piece is really about, are we fundamentally transforming our processes? Are we fundamentally transforming people's belief systems and decision making around my career, around my experience, around what's going to happen to me when I'm in that system? And if we're not doing that work, then I just don't think we're doing the work.
Yeah. Yeah. I love what you're saying because, I mean, one, that's the reason for the show, right? When we think about the third dimension, right, is how are we changing behaviors? How are we actually going in and creating impact? And you brought up just an aspect about the work that leaders are doing in this space and what's happening. And it always seems to start around, hey, we started a BRG, or we're going down that process of awareness and doing unconscious bias training and things of that nature. And so when you think about corporate, and you think about just understanding, you talked about a little bit around systemic racism. Do you feel that one, practitioners and companies really truly understand what systemic racism is and how it impacts their employees, Black and brown people today, and what that means for them and the things that they have to do in order to actually now start to solve for that in the corporate space?
Racial anxiety is high, my friend, amongst
Yeah.
people. And what
Yeah.
that means essentially is that people are fundamentally scared of talking
Mm,
about race.
yeah.
They are fundamentally feel ill equipped. They fundamentally have to look at something they've never had to look at. Like if you're racially blind or racially neutral, that means you basically have denied the fact that racism or race is part of your daily existence, right? Because
Yeah.
nobody's putting up the mirror to you and saying, right now you can recognize yourself as a brown person and a Black person. Like that doesn't happen to white folks, right? Nobody puts up a mirror and says, hey, look, now you're a white person. This
Yeah.
doesn't happen. The world is designed for certain needs and for certain groups of people. So I think fundamentally there's a lot of racial anxiety. And I think that historically it is much easier to talk about gender. It is much easier to talk about, and it's not that easy, by the way, to talk about LGBTQ issues at all. But I think relative to race, it still has had, in my experience, a lot more leeway in some instances, not all, because I think trans rights, for instance, people have a very hard time talking about trans issues. But race has fundamentally been a very volatile and hard topic. And one of the things that I did when I came to Alphabet is I said, listen, like, doing this work for a very long time. I am not interested in a like surface level job. Like I'm interested in fundamental systemic change with these moonshot companies that are basically startups or they're starting from the ground up, right? They have an opportunity to integrate into their systems right from the get-go. Right. We're not wasting time here. I'm not going to set up ERGs for you. I'm not going to set up mentorship programs for you. I want to fundamentally change the mindsets and the decisions and the actions of these leaders who lead their companies to whatever it is in the world that they end up doing. And part of that conversation was we have to center race. We just have to do it. And it's not easy. I can tell you that. But I think that I'm seeing more of an appetite for it, but I don't think people realize the kind of work they're going to have to do to get there. They're going to have to do a lot of introspection about why can't I talk about race? What is my white identity or my Asian identity or my this identity? How does that play into this? How am I making decisions that actually privilege one group of people over the other? And I think that people have a very hard time with that because I think fundamentally in tech too, there's an assumption, it's an underlying assumption, Cedric, that, you know, it's fundamentally a fair place. Like, it's like it's progressive. Tech is progressive, right? And so I think that that self identity also sometimes gets in the way of being able to look at, well, but what are we not doing that we should be doing? Or what are we not doing that's having adverse impacts? Because it calls into question your self belief, right? That we are inclusive, that we are equitable, that we are diverse. But, the reality is we're well beyond that now. And I think people are recognizing we have a lot more work to do.
Yeah. With that being said, there's a lot of stuff that's happening today, in society, right?
Mhm.
Recently you got Juneteenth becoming a national federal holiday, and then you also just have so much talk around critical race theory and just all of these things that are
Mm.
happening, and so a lot of times you hear this comment that just hey, we're in a post racial society.
Mm.
And I have a comment to that, but I want to know, like, what's your thoughts on that, right? When you hear, organizations, talk about that, hey, we're in a post-racial society, or, you start to hear people say, I don't see color, or you start to, get around this talk of, hey, we're focused on diversity of thought and we don't look at these other aspects. And so, like, what is that when you think about and you hear that as a practitioner, like, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I want to hear your thoughts on this too. I think the question that I ask people is, how does that belief serve you? How is it serving you? Because it's serving you. And people have worldviews or mental models about how the world works, right? And those are based on our life experience or based on who we've interacted with and who we haven't interacted with. It's based on, how we've moved through a system, right? So like the myth of meritocracy has a huge part to play in this, right? We, especially in the United States and definitely North America broadly speaking, like this idea that if you work hard and you do the right thing, you get an education, and you do all these things, right, that everybody should be doing, then you should make it through the system. Because that's how I got there, right? And when you don't do that, inevitably, there must be something wrong with you. And what happens in that is that we also reinforce all the stereotypes about Black and Brown and other people about why they can't make it. Because by the way, I can make it as a man, or I can make it as a white person, or I can make it as somebody else who has more advantage or privilege. So, part of this is like interrogating, why do I believe that that's true? How is it servicing me? And what I would say is that it allows us to maintain the status quo. Because if you're somebody who's benefited from the system, and by the way, I've benefited from the system. I'm a South Asian woman, right? How people read me is different than how they might read my Black sister, right? So I benefit from the system, but I also know I hit the ceilings, right? I start to hit the ceilings. I start to hit all of the racism in the way that it's going to come to me, right? But I also benefit from it. So I think part of it is like I think people are scared that if we actually started to look at race and racism, we'd actually have to ask, how do we redistribute the benefits? How do we actually reimagine what advantage means and who has it? And I just think that people are fundamentally scared about that. And they don't want to believe that they've been part of the problem. They don't want to believe that they've actually been part of perpetuating racism. Because who wants that? Who wants to believe that about themselves? But we all contribute. Like I love what Kendi says, right? We're all a part of the system. We all contribute to creating like a racist system, and it's true. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to hold itself up so well. There's a reason why it works so well.
Yeah, right. And it's something, you took the word out of my mouth, and it was that word of status quo. And
Yes.
it's that knowing that you have to change. Look, as humans, right?
Hmm.
Changing is hard, right? Moving in a different direction, transforming, it is hard. And
Yeah.
when change, we can all say, hey, I love change, I love how things change, but inherently we don't, right? We like for things to be consistent. We like how, things stay the same. And when you think about, just that question around post-racial society, I always ask the question around, and I love the question that you had around how does that benefit you? I also ask the question of post from what?
Yeah.
Right? Because
Fully.
that goes into an understanding of, do we know the history and how we got to the place? Because
Completely.
we're focusing so much on the what, but we're not understanding the why. Like,
Yeah.
why are we here today in this
Yes.
space? And do
Yes.
we understand how we got to this place? And
Yes.
so that's always something that, you have conversations and you want people to really see an individual, as well as see the community and kind of what's happened over time and what are some of those things that have contributed to maybe how society looks at it, right? I've always, thought about this idea, and it's really been kind of a big push over the last 2 years around, there's a way around how people view us, as Black and brown people. But then the question really comes is like, who are we to ourselves, right? And really understanding that when we think about post-racial, a lot of times I see that people are thinking that the start of Black people, African Americans, brown people started at slavery.
Right. Yeah.
And if we're thinking about that as a start, then you could say post, things have gotten better, things have improved. But unless we understand that that wasn't the start, right? There was a lot that happened before that, right? And we have to understand the whole picture to then understand that, oh, things might not be post-racial as I may have thought they were. There's a lot of work that needs to happen. And so, just understanding, like having those discussions, it's a West African turnaround, Sankofa, looking back to
Hmm.
influence, and being
Mm.
able to move forward.
Mm.
And that's something that, I think that in corporate, and I love to get your thoughts. I feel that we don't always want to look backwards. We don't always want to
Yeah.
figure out, when we talk about systemic racism, we don't,
Yeah.
like you said, the systems are held up some way, right? That means that we're contributing to this system in some way that you might have not created it, but you keep it going, you keep it thriving into what it is today. And until we get to that place to where we understand that this is something that we fundamentally have to break down and rebuild into something that's more equitable and something that's more inclusive for everyone, we're not going to get to the place. And as you said, BRGs are great, but at the end of the day, what change does it create in the overall system that has already been created?
Yeah, and ironically, in that example that you just gave, like we're asking people who have to continue to face the system and the trauma of the system, quite frankly, to
Oh, the
also then have the
trauma.
burden of changing it, right? Which is a re-traumatization of the thing that you're experiencing on a day to day. But your point around history is so important because one of the things that for me is from a systemic change perspective, so plus 1,000, everything you just said,
Yeah.
is that if we actually don't have a historical view, we don't get very far. So I'm
Mm.
completely like aligned with you on that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I do a lot with leaders I have in my entire career, but definitely where I am now, is for them to start to see it as a historical problem.
Yeah.
So it's historical in the sense of, like you said, like in the context of the world, in the context of North American society in the United States, for sure. Which again, we can go back 1492, we could go back further even, right? But it's also historical in terms of our own organizations, because the organization didn't start from the moment that you actually decided to like have like you had a startup idea, right? And then it gets started. No, what came before that? What came
Yeah.
before that, right? And what came
Yeah.
before that is a history that informed you, and the history that built
Hmm.
you, right? That then informs your idea, that then informs the business, that then informs the organization. So I think for me, it's really important for people to look at equity, inclusion, and representation from the perspective of history, that it is a
Mm.
historical problem or historical injustice that we're actually trying to solve for, which, by the way, makes it much harder. And I'm very
Hmm.
clear about that with people. I'm like, listen, it's not an easy problem to solve, but that is the work. And if you're interested in actually solving for history so that then we can have a different present and future, then we've got a shot at this.
Yep.
But if you're interested in thinking about this from the perspective of a moment in time, like some crisis happens and all of a sudden everybody wakes up and, and then everybody falls back asleep, this is the stuff that happens. But if you're carrying the history, it's very hard to fall asleep because you know that, right, we've got something that has to be addressed in the before, the now, and the beyond. And I just think that unless we have that point of view, again, we're not getting very far in making change in outcomes and injustice. I just don't think we do.
Yeah, trauma. I read a good book, My Grandmother's Hands. It talks about, as a boy, he used to wash his grandmother's hands and feet. And he used to ask her, like, why are they so rough and like, why are they so tough? And she talked him through when she was little, she had to pick cotton. When she reached in, her hands, would bleed in the beginning, but as she kept reaching in, they would callus up. And that's lived with her even after, she stopped. And it talks about, how trauma lives in the body of who we are, right? And what we have to do to actually go in and solve for that. And it's not an easy process, right? And it's a process to where we have to be present in our lives and every day, right? To really be conscious, right? And really understand what's happening, what's going on, why am I doing the things that I'm doing, right? Should this be the right way I approach the situation? Should I be thinking about it this way? And so it's so much that just goes right into it to where, like you said, it's not going to happen overnight. Look, it took hundreds of years to build the system that we're in today. And so it's going to take time to move through it. But at the same time, we have to understand that at least for the work that we do today, we have to set it up and make progress so that we can hand that baton off to the next generation and they can take it further ultimately to we get to this place to where we see each other, right, as human beings, as brothers and sisters, as a part, right, of that society, right? Not necessarily you just got inserted into, right? But no, you're a part of it, right? You are of this as I am. And so that becomes I don't want to say a battle, but it becomes a process that we have to work through. And so, you brought up a little bit of the external piece, and I want to touch on this a little bit. With so much that's happened in society, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor, Tatiana Jefferson, in what ways do external pressures affect the work that we're doing? How is it detracting us? Is it helping make progress? What is happening? And in the way in which corporate companies react to it, how is that moving or not moving this work forward that we're doing?
Yeah, it's a great question, Cedric. I think your word react is the right word to interrogate a little bit here, because I
Yeah.
think that that's exactly partially the issue, right? Is that, I mean, in some ways, like, again, with George Floyd's, murder and that kind of catalytic moment, we saw this sort of energy, right? We saw an energy, we saw kind of like a quote unquote awakening happening within many corporate institutions, at least on the face of it. But again, like, I just don't think that people are aware of what work is required. Like, you can say this is something that has a huge impact, this is terrible, it shouldn't happen, da da da. But George was not the first person that was murdered by first black man to be murdered by the police, or black woman. Black women have been murdered by police, historically. So I think the question is, well, why did you wake up right now? Like, why was it now? And then what are you going to do with that? Because if you didn't get it before George, you probably still don't get it.
Yeah.
But are you willing to learn? Are you willing to put in the effort and the time to figure this out? And I think this is where the tension for a lot of equity, inclusion, and diversity practitioners who take up race, by the way, because not
Hmm.
everybody does, that's where the tension is. Because I think what people initially kind of said, yeah, yeah, we're signed up to like tackle race, we're going to give $20 million towards this, and we're going to like start more conversations with black and brown folks. Great. And then what? Like, have you translated that into real change for your employees? Have you translated, your giving into more than just giving, right? So I think this is where the tension is, because I think what a lot of practitioners, and I don't want to speak for everybody because I think everyone has maybe a different experience on some level. I think, but in my conversations with folks, where the tension is that we in some ways thought, oh my God, there's an opening. Wow. Now we can talk about race. Now we can
Yeah.
actually do this work. And then all of the barriers we already knew, all of a sudden they came back up, and it's like, okay, So we could talk about it for a nanosecond.
Yeah.
And maybe we could push the needle a little bit more than we were before, but we still got a long road to go. And I think this is why you're seeing a lot of exhaustion amongst practitioners. This is why you're seeing a lot of folks feeling very tired and very
Yeah.
frustrated, hopeful on some level, but also frustrated on another level. And I think it's because the reality is there's a tension. The reality is a tension,
Yeah.
right? Between what people say that they want and the work that they're going to need to do to get there and their willingness to do that work. And I think this is where our work is, unfortunately or
Yeah.
fortunately, as practitioners. But it can be highly frustrating for folks when they're not seeing the kind of movement that people say that they want, but are unwilling to invest in.
Yeah. It's it's an emotional thing, and it's something to where when you're dealing with this work, you take on the you're going into a situation that you didn't create, but you're leaving with something that from that relationship, right? Whether it's good or bad, out of those discussions as a practitioner, and carrying that, right, and really going through that process of having the right intentions, wanting to go in and have those discussions, and then you get hit with a brick wall, whether that's leadership, whether that it doesn't align with the way our financial commitments are as an organization, right? What we're trying to do to grow the business, all these things come into play to where then it makes it even worse, like the emotion that you get, because now you're trying to move something forward and do something that's going to really progress this work. But then ultimately you're getting stalled. And so, for practitioners that are listening, right, they're trying to figure out, what do I do? Like, I've been just trying and trying, is my approach wrong? I don't, I just feel like I'm not making progress. I still feel like we're dealing with the cultural issues and all of that. How should practitioners in corporate America approach? Like, where should they start when it comes to whether they're having to kind of reimagine, their programs internally right now, or they're starting from scratch? Like, can you give some inputs into what should they be thinking about and where should they be starting so that we can really, really create change that's going to be impactful and that's going to last as we continue down this journey?
Yeah, I think we have to accept that the change is going to be long term.
Hmm.
And I've said this, definitely with my work at Alphabet. It's like I need you all to be set up for long term investment and change. That is fundamental. And I think for folks that come into this work, whether they have a history of doing this work or they don't have a history of doing this work, without that point of view, it's going to be disappointing and frustrating right from the get go. So I think that that is a fundamental thing. And I don't think that I don't even think that that is sort of, hey, let's just set 5-year goals. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm
Oh
saying
man.
is that we have to be clear about what is the problem we're trying to solve again, right? Am I trying to solve the fact that women don't have mentorship programs, or am I trying to solve the fact that women are being treated unfairly in the outcomes that they're having in pay and performance and whatever else? Those are not the same thing, right? So
Hmm.
we got to get clear about what is it that we're trying, what are the outcomes that we want here, and then we need to set everybody up for that long-term investment. And that is where I would say that I think one big skill for any practitioner, and I'm sure for those who've been doing this for a long time, I think this would resonate. You're a strategist. This is why it's in my title too, right? Being a strategist is fundamentally important. It's knowing how to maneuver and when to maneuver, right? It's kind of
Mm,
looking at a system and saying, all right, like it's kind of almost having like that ninja superpower and saying, all right, this is where the force is. I got to go where the force is, right? Or
yeah.
I shouldn't go where the force is because that's just going to backfire on me. I got to go around to get to the force, right?
Yeah.
It's always doing that, always kind of looking at being able to see the system, how it's
Mm,
operating, how power flows, who has the power, who doesn't, who's cohorting with who. Like, if I talk to this person, is that going to get me there? Or if I talk to that person, like I am constantly doing that every single day. I think that kind of strategic sense, I think is a bit more empowering, because what it does is when you hit the roadblock, it's not like, oh my God, I hit the roadblock, like it's all over. Sometimes it is all over, by the way, but sometimes it's not. Maybe it's like, but maybe that's not the door you need to go through.
yeah. I
Maybe there's
like it.
another door you need to go through, right? So it's actually about being able to be adaptive and malleable as a leader in the space, and being strategic as a leader in the space, and then knowing that you're constantly maneuvering to get to those outcomes that we've defined. And you have to take the right people to those outcomes, to achieving those outcomes. And I would say that that's why you have to start with leaders. Like sometimes you can't start with leaders because it's not possible in the context of an organization. You kind of have to work your way up, and that's fine. And I've had to do that in the context of my career at times. But as much as you can get closest to the power centers and start with the change there, the more you're going to have downstream impact. And that I think is so important. I spend a lot of time with leaders and a lot of time with execs and a lot of time with the people that hold the most power because, quite frankly, if they're not changing and they're not making different decisions, then
Yeah.
that is affecting everything else, right? So it's doing that work and then it's also working from the bottom up and figuring out like what is the balance of that
Yeah.
and where is the time, where am I spending my time and energy and resource here, and is it getting me closer again and getting them closer to those outcomes that we want? If not, let me recalibrate and try this again. And I think it's giving yourself grace around that too, because this work is exhausting, as you
Yeah.
know, and so it allows you to again stay alive in this work. And at the same time, I want to just acknowledge that that's exhausting in and of itself
Yeah.
because you're like, oh my God, every day, I'm having to maneuver all the time. But I'd say that's a fundamental aspect of how this work gets done.
Yeah, no, I love it. I like the strategist piece, and I got another question on it in a second. But just even brain, like when you think about as a practitioner, and this is something that we have to get to a point to as well, is that it's hard to change a problem when you're a part of it, when you're operating
Oh yeah.
in it.
Oh,
And that's the part to where that's where that self-reflection comes in. And you have to really say, how am I contributing to this, right, this system? How am I contributing to this work? Am I doing things to where I am not demonstrating as a leader what I want the rest of the organization to demonstrate in a way that we, in our behaviors, in the way that we operate on a day-to-day basis. And I think sometimes that is a difficult piece for a lot of leaders because we all have privilege. And when you privilege and benefit from certain systems, once again, it's difficult to change. It's difficult to then, recalibrate and say that it's possible that I may not, or I probably won't get the same benefits that I've gotten or that I'm receiving now if I make this change. But we have to
exactly.
consciously make the change and move forward. And from a leadership perspective, the direction of leadership goes is the direction the organization goes. And
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
the group and the organization is looking up at the leaders and saying, we're taking the leader, we're taking the lead from you. So the direction that you go is the direction that we go. And that's something that for leaders, right, being able to really understand, how do I make sure that I set that the vision, which is what I'm going to get to now, the vision for the organization. And as you said, strategist, being a strategist, you have to have vision. If we don't
You
know where we're
must.
going, then
Yeah.
we're a boat without a rudder. We're out with no
Yeah.
compass. We have no GPS in the
Yes.
direction. And so,
Yes.
to help the leaders really kind of bring this home that's listening, when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what do you see as the vision for DE&I, so that as folks are listening, it could give them something to grapple onto to say, I like that direction. And it gives them kind of a place to where this is where we're going, this is where we should be headed, or at least pointing towards as we do that work. And so we really love to get your input on what's that vision, because the strategy is ultimately getting us to whatever that vision is, right? Same way we create the vision for the organization should be the same way we create the vision for our people in DE&I. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, that's a big question. One thing I would say is that I think we need to fundamentally, again, change the outcomes that people are having, that historically underrepresented folks have had in the context of organizations, or even like the fact is that sometimes we don't even have Black and Brown people in our organizations,
There you
right?
go.
To change
There
the
you go.
outcomes for. So I think that there is definitely a piece around like we need to change fundamentally the outcomes that people have into our organizations, getting in our organizations, and then being in our organizations. But I also think that, I wanna live in a world where it is no longer a question whether a Black person is qualified.
Mm,
I wanna live in a world where Black and brown folks are not worried about whether they'll be able to buy a home. I wanna live in a world where seeing a Black or brown or woman leader is not something to question, but to think is just normal. It's part and parcel of who we are and how we live. I want to live in a world where Black, brown folks, women, LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities are actually the designers of technology that is changing our world for the good. Like that's what I want, you know? And then what I do is I work myself backwards and I say, okay, if those are the things that I want to see, then what is it going to take for us to get there? What are the steps? And who needs to be involved? How do they need to be involved? What is the work that I need to do with them to help get us there? And that's the vision I came to with Alphabet. I said, hey, you all are doing big things in the world, right? This is massive what you're doing, right? Great. That's the vision about what all the pieces of the puzzle in terms of what you all do in the world, right? So I'm going to work backwards so that the outcomes that you have are actually not adverse and the outcomes that you have are not re-perpetuating the same kind of reality that we live in today that is clearly not serving so many communities and so many people. And that is absolutely unacceptable to me.
Yeah, I love it. That's like the second I have a dream speech right there. It is such a, I would say this, that's a conversation that more leaders need to have. And you need to have them with your leadership team to really understand what's the future of the organization and what's the vision and how does this vision connect, right, with the people that we have, the culture that we have, all of that, which is a part of it, right? It's all a part of it. And we really have to understand that vision because that's going to get us to that why. That's going to get us to making sure that we can grab, the heartstrings of everyone and make sure that they know this is why we need to make this change. This is the place that we're trying to go. And we can't get there if we can't do the work now in order, to set ourselves up, right? And it's about planting those seeds, right? I'm an avid gardener, right? Planting those seeds, knowing that I'm not going to have it tomorrow, right? It takes time. It takes nurturing the soil. It takes watering. It takes caring for it, making sure that, as things come up, right, we redirect. We make sure may have to care in a different way, but it's a lot of stuff that we have to do in order to make sure that we ultimately get the fruit and the harvest out of that. And so, folks are listening, and we've talked about it, and we're coming close to the end here. But I want to make sure that you finish listening to this episode. Now, these are like two things that you can do right now in your sphere that you can get down this path of really making change. If you had to give, the listeners two, maybe three things, what would you say like after this, whether they should be thinking about something, whether they should go and have conversations, doing something like what advice would you give them so that they can take action now and start down that process?
Equity is a practice.
Mm,
It's something that we have to live and do and be every single day. And it is not something that's automatic either, especially if you haven't had to practice it and you haven't had to like do it, actively speaking. So I think the one thing that people should do is get into the mindset of building a practice of equity. And that means
I like it.
increasing your capability, your knowledge, your skills, and your sense of being so that you are oriented towards being on the path of equity every single day. And some days you're going to get it wrong. And some days you're not going to know. And some days you're going to be afraid. But guess what? That is true for all of us people of color and all of us BIPOC folks and all of us,
Yeah.
underrepresented folks. We're scared. We don't know every day, So I think for me, fundamentally, if you belong to an overrepresented group, I need you to get on that path. And I need you to know that all those feelings that are going to come up are normal, but you need to start confronting them because underrepresented folks don't have a choice but to confront them every single day. We got to do it every single day to survive, right?
Yeah.
We got to do it every single day to succeed. And so building that equity practice is fundamentally important. And it's something that I do a lot of work with leaders on is building their knowledge and their skills and their capability to have that equity practice and getting them into that space of this is not a one-off. This is not a but if when this is a no, it's part and parcel of how I lead. It's part and
Yep.
parcel of how I
Yep.
lead. And to your point earlier about the vision, so then I can see how I'm going to contribute to the world that I actually want to see happen in the future, right? Because I
Mm,
can't do that unless I actually have the tools. So,
yep.
people creating those tools, giving those tools, building those tools is fundamental for us to get to that endpoint, whatever that endpoint is.
Yeah. No, I love it. I love it. I love it. Look, we're getting close to the end here, and you talked about capabilities and orienting yourself, right, as a leader. Kind of to cap off the discussion. What are some of those gems that that others can use, whether that's reading, movies, content that you've seen, to where they can really just continue to dig deeper into the understanding, the knowledge, and really building that competency. Do you have some of those go to or some of those books or things that can help folks as they're going through and just figuring out what more can I do and where can I go to get more information?
Yeah, I think on the more what more can I do? Sometimes when I'm talking to different groups of people and leaders, they'll say something like, but what can I actually do? And, we're in the moment of like having a conversation, and I'm asking them to be self reflective, and I'm asking them to self inquire, and I'm asking them to dig into themselves and really ask some hard questions. And I'm like, but you are doing something. You're doing the thing
Mm,
actually that I need you to do.
yeah,
There's all other kinds of doing too. But if you don't do this piece, we're not going to get very far. And so I think that
yeah,
introspection piece, which is very individual and collective on some level, is fundamentally important, and it is a tangible thing, right? So if you are somebody who hasn't had to think about race, or makes the comment that we're lowering our bar by hiring diversity hires,
yeah,
all of that stuff, if you have got that stuff going on in your head, then I want you to pause and ask the question, why? Like, where does that come from? Why am I holding on to it? Why do I think it's true? And so I think that fundamental introspection is very, very important. And there is a lot of like resources out there now,
yeah.
a lot and lot and lot of resources, I think, that are great. But I definitely think, like, I mean, and there's lists and I'm not going to give you them, but I think what I want people to do is be in an active conversation with those resources, as opposed to a passive conversation.
Mm,
Because I'm
I like
seeing
it.
a lot of people read things and watch things, and I come back and we try to have a conversation, and I'm like, well, did you read anything? Did you watch
Yeah.
anything? Like, did
Did you
you
pay
really?
attention?
Right, right. So it's not a passive activity, it's an active activity. And so I need people to be actively present in that, and not to say, okay, I just want to learn. No, no. I want to learn because I fundamentally want to see something change in me and in others, in my family, in my community, in my workplace. And so I'm going to have to use up some of my social capital after I learn something in order to help make that change. And I think that is key, right? Learn,
Mhm.
gain the knowledge, gain the capability, but then take that back. Use your power to actually
Yeah,
affect someone's life. And then we're going to get somewhere. Otherwise, we're kind of are in the sort of the vicious cycle of learning constantly, because sometimes that's a
yeah.
scapegoat, right? The learning piece is a scapegoat to actually doing something. And I'm saying that they have to go hand in hand.
Mm. Love it. I love it. I love it. Well, look, this has been an amazing conversation. Before we go, do you have any, shout outs, any parting words? And where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, they can find me. I'm on LinkedIn, so please connect, and yeah, send me a shout out. I love meeting new people and building community, so that's part of something that's really important to me. I just again want to thank you, Cedric. I think that
Oh, I
these
love it.
conversations are so important, and you're creating space for an honest conversation, and I
Yeah.
really, really, really appreciate that, and have loved some stories that you've told me about your own life, and that you
Yeah.
shared with so much vulnerability and openness. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
No, no, no problem. Look, thanks you for joining. Like we have to have more of these conversations, and we have to make sure that they're honest and make sure that we are coming in with the right intent. Right, we're learning. We're making sure that we are doing something with that power. Right, we're being responsible with the power that we have in the spaces that we have, so that we can create change, not just for ourselves, but for others around us. Because we're going to succeed or fail as a whole, right? And there is no individualism, right, when it comes to how a society moves forward. So definitely, thank you. Well, look, everybody, that does it for us. Thank everybody for joining us on another episode of the 3D Podcast. This has been Cedric, and you've been listening to Salima Bhimani, Chief Strategist and Director of Equity, Inclusion, Systemic Change at the Other Bets at Google.